Well, thank you, Danny. If in the course of human events Alberta becomes an independent state, we'll have to have a plaque somewhere to Danny's contribution to getting it all started. It's a pleasure for me to be on the same platform as two of my favorite professors in the entire world. I never studied with Barry Cooper, but I have spent many a wonderful day in a boat fishing for lake trout in the Northwest Territories with Barry. There's very few people who you can spend a day with more interesting than Barry. And it is a real honor for me to follow Leon Craig, who was the most influential professor I ever had at university. And I say that despite the fact that he gave me the lowest mark I ever had at university. It's interesting, I'm in a session called the case for separation, because I'm not quite there yet. I'm close. And I don't hold out a lot of hope. I really don't. Did the Prime Minister say anything when Yves-François Blanchet said if Alberta was going to start a green state, he'd support us, but if we're just going to have an oil state, he wants nothing to do with us, but please keep sending the money? No, the Prime Minister did not say a thing. Is he going to side with Alberta over the bloc? No. Is he likely to side with Alberta on Trans Mountain if the NDP and the Greens refuse to vote for his party as a result? No. There are more and more cases all the time of the way things are stacked against us. I think we'll know by February whether or not there's any hope for us, because there's a big project coming up now north of Fort McMurray called the Frontier Oil Sands Mine. It's been approved by provincial and federal regulators. The company involved, which is Teck Resources out of Vancouver, has done an awful lot of work. They have signed economic participation agreements with all 14 First Nations and Métis communities in the area. They have worked out a plan for reclamation as they mine that will allow the native buffalo herd, the bison herd in the area, to move around and still have all the range it needs during the 40-year lifespan of the mine. It should be a slam dunk for the federal cabinet to approve it, but we will know in February whether they're prepared to go ahead with it or not. That will be another very clear sign to me whether or not Confederation could ever be made to work for Alberta. I mean, I want to give you a couple of numbers when we start. We've talked about the CPP, and I've heard, very intelligent people whose opinions I respect, say, well, there's really no reason for Alberta to start its own pension plan. I would do it just for the entertainment value. But on an economic scale, over the last 10 years, we have contributed $27 billion more to the CPP than our seniors have received in benefits. This is demographics. This is not a scheme by Ottawa to fleece Alberta. That's equalization. Equalization is the setup so that Alberta's always paying and others are always receiving, no matter how much their economies improve. CPP, it's because we have a very young population that has fairly high incomes. That's why we end up contributing more than we receive. But last year, Alberta contributed 16.5% of all the CPP premiums paid in the country. We're 11% of the population, and our seniors received back 10.6%. The gap would have to be made up by other people in all the other provinces if we withdrew. And the extra $27 billion over 10 years could have been given to AIMCO, the Alberta Investment Management Company, which is a pretty well-run corporation, which does operate at arm's length. Usually you can't get they won't listen to the politicians pressuring them. So there's lots of examples of why, if Alberta were to leave, we would be better off. I always say that I think there's a huge difference between Quebec separation and Alberta's potential separation, because Quebec never wants to go because it can't give up the money. And if we left, we'd be better off. Maybe not initially. Markets would adjust. People would be uncertain about whether or not to invest in the new republic or dominion or commonwealth. But eventually, I think it's incontrovertible that Alberta would be economically better off. But it's a big mountain to climb. Jacques Parizeau called Quebec independence the never-ending trip to the dentist. And he, of course, was the premier in charge of the last referendum in Quebec in 1995. We would not take forever. Our extraction would not be never-ending. I think if we decided to go, we would go fairly quickly. But there is a big mountain to climb, and that's not an argument against independence. It's simply a reality. You need a number of things to happen before we become independent. Some of them will happen fairly quickly. Some of them would take longer. Would we be like Brexit? Would we be like the Brits, and who've been now 3 years in this incredibly bitter debate with all sorts of manipulations and shuttling around and new allegiances and broken promises? Would it take that long? Well, it could take that long. I don't think it would be as acrimonious. But you need a vessel for independence. It's not just going to be those of us sitting in this room or the 800 people who were at the Wexit rally in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago saying, we want independence. There are a number of factors that have to be done first. There needs to be a leader. I think in the late 80s, if Preston Manning had come along and said the West wants out rather than the West wants in, we would now be an independent country. He had that kind of credibility. It would take somebody of that stature. Now, of course, Preston was not a politician, but he had the credibility, he had the recognition that is needed. And that's what you need. You need a leader of that status. You need René Lévesque, Alberta's René Lévesque, who used to be a journalist. You need an organized party. There has to be a separatist party. We'll hear from one of the groups that's thinking of or has already become a party later. But you need to have an organized party. It needs to win an election. The Parti Québécois did not become a threat to Canadian unity until it won the provincial election in 1976 in Quebec. It drove out nearly all of the head offices that were in Quebec that weren't put there by the federal government. Air Canada didn't move because the federal government was funding it. CN didn't move at the time because it was there by federal law. But Toronto became the financial center of Canada. A lot of people forget this. Montreal was the financial center until the Parti Québécois was elected. Toronto became the financial center after that because its politics were more settled. So you need an election win. You need a resolution in the legislature that passes with strong majority support, and you need a referendum. You have to have the support of a vast majority of Albertans, and I hope Saskatchewanians too, if you're going to leave Confederation. Those things do not come easily. There will not be, if we decide we want to have a referendum on leaving the country, there will not be a love-in the way there was in 1995. You may remember there was a rally. It was called the Unity Rally. I keep calling it the love-in. Air Canada gave people next to free tickets to fly to Montreal on the eve of their referendum in 95 and beg and plead with Quebecers to stay. That would have put me off. If I were a Quebecer who was on the fence about whether or not to leave, all of these people rushing in and going, oh, please don't leave, we love you so much, would have put me over onto the yes side. We will not get that in Alberta. And Barry can correct me because I'm sure he knows this fellow from the UFC, Trevor Thome. Is that how he pronounces it? Or Thome? Trevor Thome, an economist at the University of Calgary, put out some figures recently where he said the richest jurisdiction in Canada, which is Alberta, is only 3/4 as well off as the richest jurisdiction in the United States. And Ontario, because of its green energy plans for the last 10 years, is now only slightly wealthier than West Virginia. And the maritime provinces are at or below the lowest U.S. state, which is Mississippi. And so I would have thought, that's going to be a wake-up call. People are going to say, well, the next prime minister has to focus on improving our productivity, pumping up our economy. What was the one thing most Central Canadian commentators looked at? Well, I don't know why Alberta's upset, because they're still the richest province in the country. And it's as Leon said, I mean, there's this resentment and whining and pettiness, particularly when it comes to success in Canada, when it comes to the success of Alberta. So it will not be an easy go. But I want to read you the first sentence from the U.S. Declaration of Independence to give you a sense of what it is I'm talking about. So in 1776, it was written, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. You have to have a legal context for this. And that's why I'm talking about politically, there needs to be a leader, there needs to be a party, there needs to be a win in the legislature. Every delegate who went to the First and Second Continental Congresses in the United States, where they approved the U.S. colonies to break away from Britain, every one of those delegates was sent on behalf of his or her his colonial government. There were no hers. Everyone was sent by his colonial government, then to become the state government. You have to have that kind of legal context to justify all of this. Is it possible? Absolutely it is. But people who say, no, you don't need that, are like people who say, I want a new house. But I don't want to go through all the rigmarole of getting a real estate contract. And I don't want to load any boxes. And I don't want to lift anything heavy. And I don't want to rent a truck. Understand that if Alberta is going to do this, or Alberta and Saskatchewan are going to do this, there's a lot of heavy lifting involved. We will be pilloried by the rest of the country. They will not love us. If you remember the constitutional fights of the early 1990s when Quebec was threatening to go, people in central Canada in particular fell all over themselves, pleading with Quebec, just like I talked about in that Love In rally, pleading with Quebec not to go. Oh, we want you in, my Canada includes Quebec. You're not going to see T-shirts in downtown Toronto that say, my Canada includes Alberta, unless it's an Albertan who's wearing it, and they just got kicked out of the parliament. And as Barry said, it may become necessary to use arms in order to enforce it. Although I disagree with Barry about having to have the Americans come help. I'm guessing that there are probably enough guns owned by people in this room that we could get started on a pretty good defense. Not in High River. No, they kicked in the doors in High River and took all the guns. Some Albertans also will be opposed. And they will have, they're our neighbors and our friends and our co-citizens. They need to be heard. But we don't need necessarily to give in to the pressure from outside or inside. We just have to understand that it's going to be there. It won't be an easy ride if it happens, but I do think it will be far easier than it has proven to be in Quebec. And there will be calls in the rest of the country, and this is something Barry touched on, there'll be calls in the rest of the country to be very tough on us. No, we don't want a good negotiation with Alberta. They shouldn't have access to our markets if they leave. Okay, at the same time, we should be negotiating with the Americans to be able to run pipelines through Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon out to the West Coast, and to hook up with pipelines that already run down to the Gulf Coast. Fine. You know, it's funny that people have said, oh, well, it doesn't matter if Alberta wants to be independent, it's still going to be landlocked. Yeah, I give us a better chance of getting pipelines through Montana than I do of getting pipelines through British Columbia. And I don't think it would require us to become a territory of the United States or to become the 51st state or stand in line behind Puerto Rico and become 52. But there will be things, for instance, as Barry was talking about with negotiations, national debt. Despite the fact we've kicked in $600 billion over the last 50 years, there will be calls for us to take a share of the national debt if we go. There'll be requirement for us to give back federal assets. The largest military base in the country is the garrison at Edmonton. There will be calls for us to return or pay for those assets. I think we've already paid for all that stuff, but that's the things that we have to get ready for. Will it be worth it in the end? Like I said, I'm pretty close to that. I'm not quite there yet, but understand that everything that's really worth doing often takes a lot of work. Thank you.